All right, our next topic is the pathway of blood through the heart. And at first, I'm just going to try to simply read through it so that you have a basic recording of the pathway. So let's just start with that, and then I'll go back and kind of add some explanation. So our starting point is going to be on the right side of the heart, and we're going to start with the right atrium. So to do that, we have to talk about the three structures that empty into the right atrium. So the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus all drain blood or bring blood back to the heart, and they empty into the right atrium. Blood then flows into the tricuspid valve. Blood flows past the tricuspid valve then into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, blood will pass through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk will split into the two pulmonary arteries. The pulmonary arteries will go to the lungs. The blood at the lungs will be oxygenated and then flow back to the heart via 4 pulmonary veins. The 4 pulmonary veins will drain or empty into the left atrium. The left atrium will send the blood past the mitral valve into the left ventricle. Blood will then leave the left ventricle and flow through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. The aorta has many branches, and the blood will flow through the aorta and these many branches to tissues, and this is systemic circulation. All right, so now that basic recording is done, let's look at these structures and actually follow the pathway of blood through the heart at the same time that we look at the anatomy. All right, so not in this first picture is the coronary sinus, but we can see the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, and we can see actually the opening of the coronary sinus into the right atrium. But those are the three structures that are bringing blood back from heart tissue, structures above the diaphragm, below the diaphragm. So these are the three structures bringing blood back from the tissues of the body to the right side of the heart, so eventually it'll go to the lungs and get reoxygenated. So let's say that again. The superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus are venous structures that empty into the right atrium. So that's what we're seeing right here. From the right atrium, blood has to pass through an AV valve to get to the right ventricle. That AV valve on the right side of the heart is the tricuspid valve. From the right ventricle, blood then has to pass through a semilunar valve to get to a major artery. On the right side of the heart, that semilunar valve is going to be the pulmonic or pulmonary semilunar valve. So let's look at this occurring. So in this image, superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and coronary sinus empty blood into the right atrium. It then flows into the right ventricle past the tricuspid valve. From the right ventricle, it then flows past the pulmonary semilunar valve into a major artery. The major artery that blood exits the heart on the right side through is the pulmonary trunk, but you can also just say pulmonary arteries because the pulmonary trunk does split into the left and right pulmonary arteries. Then from the pulmonary artery, blood flows towards the lungs. It'll be oxygen-poor blood. That's going to the lungs to get reoxygenated. So the blood that leaves the lungs would be oxygen-rich, and this blood is going to go back to the heart via the 4 pulmonary veins. All 4 pulmonary veins empty into the left atrium. From the left atrium, blood then flows through the mitral valve, also known as the bicuspid valve, in order to get to the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, blood must flow through the aortic semilunar valve in order to get to the aorta and its many branches. From the aorta and its many branches, blood that is oxygenated will flow to body tissues and give away its oxygen, and then need to go back to the heart via the superior vena cava or inferior vena cava or coronary sinus, depending on which we're looking at. So we have this cycle of blood flow. It is important for you to know it, for you to be comfortable with it, to understand it. Definitely be familiar with things like the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, the chambers of the heart, the coronary sinus, the adjacent arteries and veins like the pulmonary trunk, the arteries, the pulmonary veins. Understand the basic idea behind pulmonary circulation and systemic circulation. Terms here like capillaries are just sites of gas exchange. So pulmonary capillaries are where we get oxygen put into the blood and give up CO2 to the lungs. Over here with the systemic capillaries, we're going to give away oxygen from the blood to tissues, and the tissues will give the blood CO2, which is a waste product that again will go back to the heart in order to be pumped to the lungs so we can breathe it out. So make sure that you go through that pathway, that you're familiar with it, that the idea that equal volumes of blood are pumped to the pulmonary and systemic circuits doesn't seem kind of incorrect. I get that a lot from students that going to go just to the lungs, and the lungs are pretty close. So why is that an equal amount of blood as to what is going to the tissues? We have a lot more tissues of the body than just what's going to the lungs. Well, the reason that there are equal volumes of blood pumped to pulmonary and systemic circuits is all the blood pumped to your body tissues will become deoxygenated, need to be pumped back to the heart and then to the lungs. So we will need to re-oxygenate all the blood that had been to the tissues. So even though the pulmonary circuit is short and the systemic circuit is long, there's equal volumes of blood pumped through both. The pulmonary circuit is short, but it's also low pressure because the blood doesn't need a lot of pressure in order to get to the lungs. They're really close. Whereas the systemic circuit is long and high friction because this long amount of blood vessels through which oxygenated blood must travel introduces a lot of peripheral friction as the blood must roll over the endothelial cells that line the inside of blood vessels. Therefore, the systemic circuit is also a little bit higher pressure. The blood needs a little bit more force in order to go farther. So that's why we see that the left ventricular wall, which pumps blood into systemic circulation, is thicker than the right ventricular wall. So that anatomy of the ventricles is reflecting that difference, the difference between the pulmonary and systemic circuit, both their length and the pressure required. So the left ventricular wall is 3 times thicker than the right because it pumps with greater pressure, or it needs to pump with greater pressure. So here's an image, figure 17.9 in your textbook, showing that. We can see that the left ventricle wall much thicker than the right. Let's also briefly talk about coronary circulation. So this is the functional blood supply to the heart muscle itself. Shortest circulation in the body makes sense. It's blood flow from the heart to the heart muscle and then back. So very short. And we can only deliver oxygenated blood to heart muscle tissue when the heart is relaxed. Otherwise, when the heart is contracted, we're actually contracting the coronary arteries themselves and blood can't get through. We also can't drain blood when the heart is contracted. The left ventricle is definitely going to receive most of the coronary blood supply because of that left ventricular wall being thicker. There's just more muscle, so more oxygen is needed on that side of the heart. So next we're going to look at the coronary arteries. So both left and right coronary arteries are going to arise at the base of the aorta. They're going to encircle the heart in the coronary sulcus, but they branch and they then kind of vary among the two sides. Many of these arteries contain what's called a junction or anastomosis, and that means there's additional routes for blood delivery in case one is blocked. However, there's not as many arterial anastomoses as there are venous anastomoses, so usually a coronary artery occlusion cannot be compensated for 100% of the time. And the heart is very important as a kind of oxygen-giving component of the cardiovascular system. It's going to make sure that the pulmonary and systemic circuit runs smoothly, that they have the pressure they need in order to pump blood throughout your body. So the heart receives about 1/20th of the body's blood supply itself. So we're talking there about the myocardium. So if we're looking at just the left coronary artery, it's going to split into the anterior interventricular artery and the circumflex artery. Whereas the right coronary artery, it's going to split into the right marginal artery and the posterior interventricular artery. So let's look at that. we have the left coronary artery, which splits into the circumflex and the anterior interventricular. Then over here we have the right coronary artery, which splits into the the right marginal artery. And then in the back it circumvents and goes all around the heart. And then we see this other split, the posterior interventricular artery. The coronary vein is a little bit easier as far as names. We have the coronary sinus, which is a special kind of bulbous structure on the back of the heart. And it's going to be formed by merging cardiac veins. There are the great cardiac vein, middle cardiac vein, and small cardiac vein. The great cardiac vein is located on the front of the heart. The middle cardiac vein is located on the back of the heart, and the small cardiac vein is located next to the right marginal artery. So great, middle, small, front, back, side. So you can kind of think of it like that. There's plenty of other kind of smaller anterior cardiac veins that do empty straight into the right atrium, but we're looking mainly at the great, middle, and small cardiac vein, which are drained into the coronary sinus, but empties into the right atrium as well. So we can see the coronary sinus in this posterior view. So they're kind of lightening everything so we can see what's in the back of the heart. We can see the great cardiac vein here in the front, the middle cardiac vein here in the back, and then over where the right marginal artery would be, we have the small cardiac vein. Here's a better view of the coronary sinus, so we're looking at the back of the heart. We can also see another view of the middle cardiac vein. Some imbalances we also want to mention are angina pectoris and a myocardial infarction, another term for a heart attack. An angina pectoris is thoracic pain. It's usually caused by kind of a fleeting deficiency in blood, and that fleeting deficiency in blood is going to be delivery of that blood to the myocardium itself. This can weaken cells, but it's usually kind of, again, that fleeting thoracic pain. It may or may not be a sign of a possible myocardial infarction in the future. So again, may or may not, it depends on the person. Myocardial infarction is the clinical term for a heart attack. It occurs because of prolonged coronary blockage, so of a coronary artery generally, and this will cause death of cardiac muscle cells. So an infarct is a condition or something that occurs that causes the death of tissue. And these areas of cell death are going to be repaired, but they're generally repaired with non-contractile scar tissue, so no longer will there be cardiac muscle cells in this area where the infarct occurred. If this occurs over a larger part of the heart than a smaller part of the heart, it could impair the contractile capability of the heart so much that a myocardial infarction causes death. And then our last topic for part A is going to be over the microscopic anatomy. So we'll cut off here just because you want to spend time on blood flow through the heart and kind of those last couple of topics. So make sure to watch the last video over chapter 17, part A, when we talk about microscopic anatomy.